So I don't know, do you see something at the moment?
It's black.
Ha, this is funny. I don't know why it's doing that at the moment. I'll have to go back. There
No,
we go.
now we see something. Yeah.
Now we see something now, but it's
Yes.
funny when I open up the PowerPoint, it shows the first slide as being black. So, okay. Thank you, Benjamin, for the great segue, because you mentioned emergence and emergent gameplay, and that's what I'll be talking about a little bit today. My name is Jeremiah Diephuis, and I work at the University of Applied Sciences, Upper Austria, and I'm a founding member of a research lab that's called Playful Interactive Environments. And today, I'm going to talk a little bit about emergence and specifically emergent behavior, emergent gameplay in the context of co-located games, which are things that we develop in our research group. And this is going to address some of the games that we've done for the Ars Electronica Center over roughly the past 10 years. So Jesper Juul basically identified these two different systems for games. There's emergence and there's progression, and I'm certain most of you are familiar with that. Emergence referring to the system of rules and mechanics, and the player can combine those and make decisions. And then we have progression, where there's more of a predefined sequence, like in an adventure game or a race to the end. And of course, most games use elements of both systems. Games like chess are a little bit more on the side of emergence, and an adventure game would be more on the side of progression. But emergence always has this certain, I would say, ideal of being like the Philosopher's Stone, because it has the capability to enhance player agency, because the player can really choose what they're going to do. They don't have to guess what the designer wanted. And because every time I play the game, it's a slightly different experience. And so particularly for co-located games, emergence is particularly interesting. Emergent gameplay is within the field of emergence in any case, but the basic idea is that the player is making choices and doing things that are possible within the game system, but probably not originally intended, at least not as the main objective. And I'm going to give you guys an example that some people will disagree with, but I think the rocket jump is a really great example of emergent gameplay. And I actually looked into this. There's really no documentation of how this happens. The first game that people claim that it was found in was Doom. I used it a lot in Quake and such, and I don't know if it was part of the playtesting when the developers were playtesting it, or if it happened later. But this idea of using a rocket to propel yourself to another part of the game world was probably not originally intended. And so it's a good example of what emergent gameplay can basically be. So we work on so-called co-located games. And the broad sense of this is that these are games that are played by people in the same physical space. That has a couple of different aspects. One of them is that you can have sort of direct social communication, of course, but probably more important is you can actually observe how other people are playing. So you can see exactly what they're doing, learn from what they're doing, and maybe even cooperate with them a little bit more closely. So we've had the pleasure and the privilege of developing games for the Deep Space and the Ars Electronica Center since 2011, although technically 2011 was not really a digital game. It looked like one. But we've tried out a lot of different games in this co-located context. And we're going to take a look at sort of how these games are set up, because that plays a bit of a role. But I think for this type of game setting, the concept of the magic circle is really important, because you not only have people playing the game, but you have people who are watching the game, and you have people who may want to enter this circle and play, or may just want to observe, or they want to have other types of interaction. And so this has been really influential in how we've designed our games. However, one of the big criticisms of the magic circle, and one that Jesper Juul addressed, is that it doesn't really take the context into account. So a game that is being played isn't just being played in this magical world all by itself, but people are watching it being played. They're yelling, they're shouting, they're communicating with people who are playing it. And so what he basically did is he suggested that we could use a slightly different metaphor for this, the magic puzzle piece, because the game play takes place within this world, within this physical location where people are watching. And so it's actually part of that space as well. And that's played a really big role in terms of how we basically design these types of co-located games. So this is actually one of the first games we did. I'll be addressing it a bit later. It's called Limelight. And what we have here, these three different colors are three different player roles, yeah? But in a very broad sense. So the people who are reds are basically the spectators. So these are people who are watching the game. Yeah? They could enter and play it as well, but in this role, they're simply watching the gameplay that's happening. Then we have the blue person who's actually interacting with a controller. There's direct interaction with the game. And then we have these yellow people, which have an indirect role in the game. And they're basically controlling these will-o'-the-wisps that you can see on the screen. They're lighting up the world. If you're interested technologically, what we're doing here is we have laser arrangers in the room. So on the edges of these surfaces that basically tell us the positions of the people standing in the room. So we know specifically where they're standing in the game world, but that's all we have, just their physical position in the room. And so this is the first model that we developed, but most of our games evolve around this basic idea of having multiple player roles and being able to easily enter the space, but also exit the game space. And when we talk about emergence, we always talk about, okay, it's these positive aspects. So being able to do whatever I want and player agency and replayability and all these things. But there's also the other side of emergent behavior, and that is that people do whatever they want, regardless of what the designer sort of intended. And in particular for co-located games, it's a major issue because I don't have the constraints that I would typically have in a game. I cannot control the camera of the player. I cannot constrain the movement as accurately as I could in an actual digital game. And this is something I think we've all seen before. It's called a desire path. And I'm certain that the planner or the architect who designed this would have preferred that people walk around it, but they think it's a lot easier just to walk through it, whether it's a magic circle or not. So I'm going to address some of these types of things that have happened with our co-located games, emergent behavior, emergent gameplay, and then give you a couple of, I guess you could say, recipes for dealing with emergence in co-located games. So the first game I'm going to talk about, we already briefly saw, it's called Limelight, and this is the start screen. It's about this little sorcerer's apprentice. His name is Limus, and he's a really, really bad magician. He failed all of his exams, and he's been sent into this dark cellar to collect 3 magic stones that are hidden in the level. Sorry, my presentation's going a little fast. And there are these monsters that he has to eliminate by collecting 3 magic stones. And these will-o'-the-wisps, the loomies, can light his way so he can see where he's going on the level. And so this is sort of what the game would look like. We have people moving around the space, and so they're creating little spotlights. And there's somebody controlling a game controller, so it's a bit like a platformer game, but he needs their help so he can see where to jump to. And what was interesting about this game is that when we intended to do it, we reversed the coordinates of the people's positions in the rooms and the actual will-o'-the-wisps. And we did this so that they didn't have to look up, 7 meters up into the top of the ceiling, and also to create a little bit more connection between the avatar and the player itself. But what actually happened was kind of interesting. If you take a look on the right-hand side, you can see that people are trying to touch their avatar, and they're even taking pictures of their avatar and themselves and approaching the screen. And another interesting thing that happened on the left, we see that people were jumping because when they left the tracking system, it would create a new avatar and also create a new color. And so this isn't emergent gameplay, it's emergent behavior, but people were behaving in ways that we didn't actually intend, and it was part of their overall game experience that they had. Another game that we worked on for this space was called Recollection, and it was a sort of space game where you had to collect digital artifacts that were lost in space and protect your ship from incoming asteroids. And it was a game for 5-6 people, could be played by more. You had to charge. We have this green area here where the energy is charged to use the lasers and to use the shields. And we have these green artifacts out in the space beyond it that are for collecting. And then we have these asteroids sort of crashing in. And what we did to increase the interaction between the audiences is that we made it possible for them to create their own asteroids. You can see Wolfie on the right there, and also to create little energy modules that would help the people out. But the funny thing is that although people definitely did this and they enjoyed it, it actually, and I don't have a picture of this, but it started a type of flame war. So people were using the screen as a way to interact with each other on a textual basis, sending each other messages and back and forth, having like an internet discussion, but in the game itself. So this is another example of emergent behavior. And my last example of emergent behavior before I get to gameplay was Diephuis, which was the last game that we actually did for Deep Space because the pandemic came after that. It's a little bit like a quiz show. You just have to stand on the right platform for the answer to each question. But what was interesting is that we wanted the winner to know that they had won. And so we used these wings from the Golden Nika character from the Ars Electronica Festival. And what we had is people were taking pictures of themselves sort of like a snow angel on the floor. Not something we had intended, but again, part of their actual play experience that they really enjoyed. Okay, but we're talking about emergent gameplay as well. So we're going to move on to some interesting examples that actually affected how people played the game. And this was a game that we made in 2014 called Fish Feast. And basically you have a virtual fish beneath you running around, and you collect these sort of grayish non-player fish, and you grow in size over time. And if you are big enough, you can actually eat the other players as well. So it's the biggest fish in the pond type principle. Yeah? It's been played a lot. And if you get eaten, then you basically become a dead fish. So you've got the fish bones here that you can see here. But what we did not really intend is this group dynamic that happened. And that you can kind of see this in this picture, that the dead, I'm going to call them zombie fish, would form a protective ring around maybe a small child who they wanted to win, or another person that they wanted to win the game in particular. And they were sort of a physical barrier. So nobody could get in to try to attack the other fish, because they were being protected by the still existent zombie fish that were moving around. Another example of interesting emergent gameplay in co-located games was in the game Swarm Defender. So Swarm Defender worked a little bit like Space Invaders. You have these invaders that are coming down from the top of the screen, and you need to shoot them with a laser. But we used proxemics to control the type of laser. So the green invaders had to be controlled, or had to be destroyed by the green laser. That would mean a player needed to be alone by himself or herself. And we could also join forces. We could join bonds. If players are standing next to each other, they could actually form a blue laser, or if there are three of them, they could form a red laser to destroy all of the invaders coming in. And I unfortunately don't have a really good picture of this. But what people realized at some point is, since we're using this tracking system to basically track the feet of the individuals, they would actually get down on all fours, and then they could have 4 separate chips that they can use to control the different colors of the lasers. So they could just have 2 if they wanted, or they would put their hand down. They would have a 3rd one for the red laser. And so this way they could basically play the game without actually cooperating with others, which was our original goal for the game. Okay, so in our abstract, we talked about a Cauldron of Emergence. And of course, we were inspired by the magical theme this year. I'm a little hesitant to actually say that you can actually design for emergence. I think in many cases that if we're talking about emergent gameplay and emergent behavior, that it's a combination of the player and a combination of the system and all these different aspects. There are a lot of happy accidents. And it's a lot easier to talk about it ex post facto than before it. But there are a couple of things that I do think played a role in all of this. And when I talk about the Cauldron, I'm actually inspired also by this animated film. It's one of my favorites by Julia Donaldson called Room on the Broom. It's also a children's book. It borrows very heavily from the Bremer Stadtmusikanten, of course. But what I like about it is that in the end, they find a solution by combining elements that they all found themselves to I'm not going to spoil the story for you, but they combine all of these elements together in this cauldron. Yeah. And I think that's sort of what it's about. This idea of, yes, I as a designer can create a certain system, but the overall play experience is also going to be decided by the player. And that those group dynamics can be very, very different. As we also saw in every exhibition of our games, every single play experience was a bit different. So here are a couple of things that I think do work, things that we've tried and we continue to try to implement. One of them is the idea of independent dynamics. And what I mean by that is that the game system is constantly doing something that attracts the user, attracts the eye of the player, of course, but that I also feel that the system will continue even if I don't interact with it. One of the biggest issues that we've had with these types of games is that people are scared of playing them because they're performing in front of others. Again, we come back to this idea of the puzzle piece. You're not alone and invisible in the magic circle, but people can watch what you're doing. Yeah. And so having a game that things are moving constantly, asteroids are crashing in, which sort of encourages you to want to jump into the scene and protect the ship from asteroids. That is something that can definitely contribute to getting people involved in it in the first place, and then trying to trying out different possibilities to prevent the ship from being destroyed by asteroids in this specific example. So having a dynamic system that continues whether or not people are playing with it, I think can contribute to that in a co-located environment. Another related aspect is systemic reaction. So once they've actually entered this space, once they're actually in the game, then the system needs to react to that. So anything that they actually walk over or touch is activated in some way. I walk over an object, it becomes part of my inventory, it follows me around. Yeah. Or if I walk over an asteroid, it blows into many, many pieces. So the system reacts to the player interaction. And sort of related to this as well, it's good if the player has the feeling that they can't necessarily do anything wrong. They can't break anything permanently. And then this is a wider idea, but this idea of having an open circle. So people should be able to walk into the space and play and leave at any time. That means, again, this idea of progression would not work very well, because if somebody leaves the game, then the game is stuck in a certain place. But that the game is constructed in a way that a player can enter and leave at any time, or they can start a little bit later in the game and they may not win, but they can still participate in some way. The same thing goes for this exchange of roles between different aspects of play. So changing from the spectator to a direct player or to an indirect player. So those are the three things that I think can contribute to creating emergence in co-located games: open circles, systemic reactions, and independent dynamics. I think I'm pretty close to the time here, so I'm just going to say thank you so much for listening, and also inviting me to give this talk. If you're ever interested in these types of games,